Across the vast expanse of the Eurasian continent lies a nation brimming with mystique and formidable power, Russia. Its history is like a majestic, turbulent river, at times flowing gently, reflecting pastoral scenes and devout faith, at others, crashing with furious waves, carrying iron-fisted conquests and societal upheavals, and sometimes frozen solid for miles, nurturing resilience and profound contemplation. From the scattered sparks of East Slavic tribes to the dawn of Kievan Rus, from the long dormancy under the Mongol yoke to the quiet rise of the Moscow Principality, from the solemnity of Tsarist coronations to the imperial glory of the Romanov dynasty, from Peter the Great's westernizing reforms to Catherine the Great's territorial expansions, from the idealistic cries of the Decembrists to the heavy steps of serf emancipation, from the storm of the Red Revolution to the colossal rise and sudden collapse of the Soviet giant, and then to the challenging path of the new federation and the dream of a resurgent great power. Russia's history intertwines glory and dreams, suffering and struggle, creation and destruction, fusion and conflict. It has not only shaped the unique soul and national character of the people on this land, but has also profoundly influenced the evolution of the world order. Let us now journey through the mists of time, trace this river back to its source, follow its winding course, and explore the extraordinary history of Russia from ancient times to the present day, experiencing its profound, complex, and captivating story. Chapter 1: Early History and the Rise and Fall of Kievan Rus. The origins of Russian history can be traced back to the period of the East Slavic tribes before the 9th century AD. Across the vast East European plain lived numerous East Slavic tribes such as the Vyatikai, Krivichi, Polyanians, and Drevlians. They subsisted on farming, hunting, fishing, and beekeeping, practiced polytheism, and worshipped natural forces. While conflicts occurred between tribes, trade and cultural exchange also existed. Their social structure was relatively loose, based on clans and tribal alliances. In the 9th century, Varangians, a branch of Norsemen, also known as the Rus, from Scandinavia began moving south along the trade route from the Varangians to the Greeks. This waterway connected the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, passing through the lands inhabited by the East Slavs. The Varangians were not only merchants, but also formidable warriors. According to the earliest Russian chronicle, the Primary Chronicle, or Tale of Bygone Years, in 862 AD, the Slavic and Finno-Ugric tribes near Novgorod, plagued by internal strife, invited the Varangian prince Rurik and his brothers to rule over them and establish order. Rurik established his rule in Ladoga, later moving to Novgorod, an event widely regarded as the beginning of Russian statehood. Rurik's successor, Oleg, possibly a relative or chief warrior, was more ambitious. In 882 AD, he led his forces south, captured the strategic center of Kiev on the middle Dnieper River, killed the local Varangian rulers Askold and Dir, and moved his capital to Kiev. Oleg declared Kiev the mother of Rus cities, uniting the two major centers of Novgorod and Kiev and laying the foundation for Kievan Rus. He further subdued surrounding East Slavic tribes, forcing them to pay tribute, and concluded advantageous trade treaties with the Byzantine Empire, demonstrating the strength of the early Rus state. Over the next century, Kievan Rus gradually consolidated and expanded under successive grand princes. Igor, Rurik's son, attempted to strengthen control over the tribes, but was brutally killed by the Drevlians while collecting extra tribute. His wife, Olga, avenged her husband and subsequently carried out administrative reforms, establishing fixed tribute collection points and amounts, thereby strengthening central authority. Olga also visited Constantinople in 957 and accepted Eastern Orthodox baptism, paving the way for the Christianization of Rus. Olga's son, Sviatoslav, was a quintessential warrior prince, spending his life on campaign. He defeated the Khazar Khaganate, which had long threatened the southern borders of Rus, gaining control of the lower Volga trade route. He also campaigned in the Balkans, contending with Bulgaria and the Byzantine Empire, and briefly occupied large territories along the Danube. However, his focus on external conquest led him to neglect internal governance, and he was ultimately ambushed and killed by the Pecheneg on his return journey to Kiev. After Sviatoslav's death, his sons engaged in civil war. Vladimir I reigned c. 980-1015, eventually emerged victorious, becoming the Grand Prince of Kiev. Vladimir's reign marked a crucial turning point. He faced the challenge of unifying diverse pagan beliefs and consolidating a state ideology. After evaluating Islam, Judaism, Roman Catholicism, and Byzantine Orthodoxy, Vladimir chose Orthodoxy. In 988 AD, he was baptized in Chersonesus in Crimea and married the Byzantine princess Anna. Upon returning, he ordered the destruction of pagan idols, enforced orthodoxy, and conducted a mass baptism of Kiev's population. The baptism of Rus was an epical event. It integrated Kievan Rus into the Byzantine Orthodox civilization, bringing advanced culture, writing, the Cyrillic alphabet, law, and art. It also significantly promoted internal unity and central authority. The church became a vital pillar supporting the Grand Prince's power, profoundly influencing Russian culture, national identity, and historical development. Vladimir also actively defended against Pecheneg raids, built border fortresses, and consolidated the state's territory. Kievan Rus reached its zenith under Vladimir's son, Yaroslav the Wise, reigned 1019 to 1054. Yaroslav quelled internal conflicts and repelled the last major Pecheneg invasion. He compiled Rus' first written law code, the Russkaya Pravda, or Yaroslav's Justice, regulating social order and legal relations. Kiev flourished under his rule, witnessing the construction of magnificent buildings like the St. Sophia Cathedral and the Golden Gate, becoming a major political, economic, and cultural center in Eastern Europe. Kievan Rus's international standing also rose significantly. Yaroslav established ties with several European royal families through marriage alliances, with his daughters marrying kings of France, Norway, Hungary, and elsewhere. However, prosperity masked underlying weaknesses. Yaroslav failed to establish a stable succession system. The rota system, or ladder system, he implemented after his death, whereby the grand princely title passed laterally among brothers before descending to the next generation, with other principalities distributed similarly, led to constant infighting among princes vying for the Kievan throne and richer lands. Concurrently, a new nomadic people, the Polovtsians, Cumans, replaced the Pecheneg and began raiding the southern borders of Rus, severely disrupting trade routes and agricultural production. From the 12th century onwards, Kievan Rus gradually fragmented. Regional principalities like Novgorod, with its unique aristocratic republic, Vladimir Suzdal, in the northeast, with good agricultural land and distance from steppe threats, and Galicia Volhynia, in the southwest, closely connected to Central Europe, grew stronger and increasingly independent from Kiev. While Kiev retained symbolic importance, its actual power and influence waned considerably. Frequent princely wars dispersed state power, setting the stage for external invasion. The era of Kievan Rus as a unified state was fading amidst internal strife and mounting external threats. Chapter 2: The Mongol Invasion and the Rise of the Moscow Principality. Just as the principalities of Kievan Rus were mired in internal division and conflict, a formidable force from the east, the Mongol Empire, was sweeping across Eurasia with unprecedented speed and scale. In the early 13th century, Genghis Khan unified the Mongol tribes and subsequently launched a series of conquests. In 1223, a Mongol reconnaissance force first clashed with a combined Rus-Polovtsian army at the Khalkha River. The Rus forces suffered a devastating defeat, foreshadowing a greater catastrophe. In 1237, Genghis Khan's grandson, Bata Khan, led a massive Mongol army, the Western Campaign, in a full-scale invasion of Rus. Facing the highly organized, tactically superior, and swift Mongol cavalry, the fragmented and disunited Rus principalities were overwhelmed. The Mongols first sacked Ryazan, then swept through the Vladimir Suzdal Principality, destroying numerous cities, including Moscow, and massacring their inhabitants. In 1240, Kiev, the once glorious capital, fell after a siege, and precious structures like the St. Sophia Cathedral suffered severe damage. The Mongol conquest was exceptionally brutal, Corpses lay everywhere. White bones covered the ground. Most of Rus, except for a few areas in the northwest like Novgorod, which likely avoided destruction by paying tribute, was conquered. The Mongol invasion inflicted devastating blows on Rus. The population plummeted, cities decayed, the economy withered, and cultural development was severely hampered. The southern and southwestern regions suffered particularly badly, with many areas remaining desolate for long periods. More importantly, the Rus principalities entered a period lasting over 2 centuries, known as the Tatar-Mongol yoke, circa 1240 to 1480. The Mongols established the Golden Horde, also known as the Kipchak Khanate, based in the lower Volga region, becoming the overlords of the Rus principalities. Rus princes had to travel to the Horde's capital, Sarai, to pay homage, receive investiture, and obtain a yarlik, patent, legitimizing their rule over their respective principalities. The Horde appointed Baskaks, overseers, in Rus to supervise local affairs and established a harsh system of tribute extortion, known as Orda or Vaikod. The heavy tribute burden further impoverished Rus. Mongol rulers frequently interfered in Rus' internal affairs, instigating conflicts among princes to maintain their divide-and-rule strategy. The struggle among Rus princes largely became a competition for the Khan's favor and the patent for the Grand Principality of Vladimir. However, Mongol rule did not completely destroy the political structure of Rus. It preserved the existing system of princely rule and the Eastern Orthodox faith. The Orthodox Church even gained certain privileges under Mongol rule, such as tax exemption, becoming a crucial force in preserving Rus' national identity and cultural continuity. Under the shadow of Mongol domination, the political center of Rus began to shift. The Vladimir Suzdal region in the northeast, being relatively distant from the direct threat of the southern steppes and possessing a decent agricultural base, gradually became the core area of Rus' political activity. Within this region, a previously inconspicuous small principality, Moscow, began its quiet ascent. Moscow was first mentioned in chronicles in 1147. Initially, it was a remote outpost of the Vladimir Suzdal Principality. In the late 13th century, Grand Prince Alexander Nevsky of Vladimir, famous for defeating the Swedes on the Neva River and the Teutonic Knights on Lake Peipus, granted Moscow to his youngest son, Daniel. Daniel and his successors adopted cautious and pragmatic policies, focusing on accumulating strength and expanding territory. Moscow's rise benefited from several factors. Favorable geographical location. Moscow was situated at the crossroads of the Oka and Volga river systems, facilitating trade and attracting population. Surrounded by forests and rivers, it was relatively less exposed to direct Mongol raids compared to other principalities, attracting numerous migrants fleeing conflict. Astute policies of Moscow princes. From Daniel onwards, successive Moscow princes like Yuri Danilovich, Ivan I Khalida, Simeon the Proud, Ivan II, displayed remarkable political skill. They continuously annexed smaller neighboring principalities through marriage, purchase, inheritance, and sometimes force, expanding Moscow's territory and power. Simultaneously, they diligently curried favor with the rulers of the Golden Horde, gaining the Khan's support through tribute and loyalty. Acquiring the Grand Princely Patent, Ivan I, nicknamed Khalida, meaning money bag, was particularly adept at leveraging relations with the Horde. He actively collected tribute for the Khan, earning his trust and repeatedly receiving the patent for the Grand Principality of Vladimir. This nominally gave Moscow authority over the northeastern Rus principalities. Ivan I also persuaded the Metropolitan of all Rus, head of the Orthodox Church, to move his seat from Vladimir to Moscow around 1326, significantly enhancing Moscow's religious and political status, making it the new spiritual center of Rus. Growing economic strength, relative stability, convenient transport links, and its role as a tribute collection hub allowed Moscow to gradually accumulate wealth, enabling it to support an army, build fortifications, and attract artisans and merchants. Moscow's ascent was not smooth. It involved long and brutal struggles with other contenders for leadership, such as Tver. However, for the most part, Moscow's princes, through patience, cunning, and skillful exploitation of horde politics, gradually gained the upper hand. In the latter half of the 14th century, the Golden Horde itself fell into internal division and decline. Grand Prince Dmitry Ivanovich of Moscow, later known as Donskoy, meaning of the dawn, began to challenge Mongol rule. In 1380, he assembled a coalition of Rus forces and decisively defeated the army led by the horde's powerful general Mamai at the Battle of Kulikovo Field on the Don River. Although the victory at Kulikovo did not end Mongol rule entirely, Moscow was sacked in retaliation by Khan Toktamish 2 years later. It immensely boosted the morale of the Rus people, shattered the myth of Mongol invincibility, established Moscow's leadership among the Rus principalities, and laid the foundation for the final overthrow of the Mongol yoke. After a century and a half of dormancy and struggle, the Principality of Moscow had grown from a minor borderland state into the core force for unifying Rus. Its future goal would be the complete overthrow of Mongol rule and the establishment of an independent, unified Russian state. Chapter 3: Formation of the Unified Russian State and the Reign of Ivan IV. After the Battle of Kulikovo, the Principality of Moscow continued on the path of consolidating its power and unifying the Russian lands. During the reigns of Vasily I, son of Dmitry Donskoy, and Vasily II, the Blind, Moscow endured difficult times, contending with the Grand Duchy of Lithuania for control over Western Rus lands and fighting brutal civil wars against internal feudal uppunnage princes, such as Vasily II's uncles and cousins. Vasily II was even captured and blinded during the Civil War, but he ultimately prevailed. He abolished the traditional rota system of succession and established primogeniture, inheritance by the eldest son, ensuring the stable transfer of power within the Moscow dynasty. The latter half of the 15th century, during the reign of Ivan III, 1462 to 1505, was the pivotal period for the formation of the unified Russian state. Ivan III was a ruler of great vision and determination, known as the gatherer of the Russian lands. Using a combination of coercion and diplomacy, he annexed the principalities of Yaroslavl, Rostov, Tver, and others on a large scale. Most importantly, in 1478, he completely absorbed the long independent Republic of Novgorod. Novgorod possessed vast northern territories and prosperous trade. Its annexation significantly boosted Moscow's power and size. Ivan III abolished Novgorod's vesh, popular assembly, and independent status, relocating its nobles and wealthy merchants near Moscow and replacing them with Muscovite officials and landowners. In foreign affairs, Ivan III achieved a historic breakthrough. As the Golden Horde weakened and fragmented, splitting into the Khanates of Kazan, Astrakhan, Crimea, etc., Moscow gradually ceased paying tribute. In 1480, Khan Ahmed of the Great Horde led an army to punish Moscow, confronting Ivan III's forces across the Ugra River. After a standoff without a major battle, Ahmed withdrew his troops, known as the Great Stand on the Ugra River. This event is considered the definitive end of Mongol rule over Russia, symbolizing the final breaking of the 240-year Tatar-Mongol yoke. Russia's status as an independent sovereign state was established. Ivan III also actively enhanced Moscow's international standing. He married Sophia Paleologina, niece of the last Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI. This marriage brought Byzantine cultural influence and court ceremonial, but more importantly, it provided a theoretical basis for Moscow to claim succession to the Byzantine Empire's Orthodox legacy. Ivan III began using the Byzantine double-headed eagle as his coat of arms and promoted the theory of Moscow, the Third Rome, arguing that after Rome and Constantinople, Moscow had become the new center of world Christianity. This laid the ideological foundation for Russia's sense of uniqueness and divine mission. He started using the title Sovereign of all Rus, Gosudar Saya Rusi, and occasionally the titles are derived from the Latin Caesar, meaning emperor. Under Ivan III, the Moscow Kremlin underwent large-scale reconstruction, with Italian architects invited to build magnificent structures like the Cathedral of the Dormition, the Cathedral of the Archangel, and the Palace of Facets, making it a center of power befitting the state's status. Ivan III's son, Vasily III, 1505 to 1533, continued his father's policies, further annexing Pskov, 1510, and Ryazan, 1521, essentially completing the unification of the northeastern and northwestern Russian lands. He also captured the strategic city of Smolensk from Lithuania, 1514. By this time, the unified Russian state centered on Moscow had largely taken shape territorially. When Vasily III died, his son Ivan IV, 1533 to 1584, was only 3 years old. During the regency of his mother, Elena Glinskaya, and the subsequent period of chaotic power struggles among the high nobility, boyars, Russia experienced over a decade of political turmoil. This period likely had a profound impact on Ivan IV's personality. In 1547, at the age of 16, Ivan IV was formally crowned, becoming the first Russian ruler to officially adopt the title of Tsar. The magnificent coronation ceremony in Moscow's Cathedral of the Dormition greatly enhanced the monarch's sacred status and authority. During the early part of his reign, circa 1547 to 1560, aided by the Chosen Council, an informal group of trusted reformist advisors, Ivan IV implemented a series of important reforms. Convening the Zemsky Sobor, this was the first national assembly in Russian history attended by representatives of the nobility, clergy, and townspeople to discuss state affairs, aiming to gain support from various social strata and strengthen central authority. Issuing a new law code, Sudebnik of 1550 revised based on Ivan III's code, it further standardized legal procedures, limited the power of provincial governors, and strengthened central judicial control. Military reforms established a standing army, the Streltsy Musketeers, equipped primarily with firearms, enhancing military capability. Standardized the Mesnichestvo system of service land tenure, requiring nobles to provide military service based on their land holdings. Local administrative reforms curtailed the power of local governors, kormlynchiki, literally feeders who lived off their posts, replacing them with local self-governing bodies and officials appointed by the center. In foreign policy, Ivan IV also achieved significant successes. He launched wars against the Eastern Tatar Khanates, conquering the Khanate of Kazan in 1552 and annexing the Khanate of Astrakhan in 1556, bringing the entire Volga River basin under Russian control. This greatly expanded territory opened routes to the Caspian Sea and Central Asia, eliminated a long-standing threat from the east, and had immense strategic significance. He also initiated expansion into Siberia, sponsoring the Stroganov family to organize the Cossack Yermak's expedition against the Khanate of Sibir. However, the latter part of Ivan IV's reign, from about 1560, took a sharp turn, descending into a period of terror known as the Oprichnina, 1565 to 1572. The reasons were complex, possibly including dissatisfaction with the results of early reforms, power struggles with the old aristocracy, paranoia about potential boyar treason, especially after early setbacks in the Livonian War, and his increasingly paranoid and cruel personality. In 1565, Ivan IV abruptly left Moscow, announced his abdication, and accused the boyars of treason and abuse of power. Persuaded to return by the populace and the church, he agreed on the condition that the country be divided into two parts: the Oprichnina, ruled directly by him with its own administration, army, the Oprichniki, and treasury, and the Zemshchina, managed by the Boyar Duma. The Oprichnina was essentially an extreme tool used by Ivan IV to crush his political opponents, destroy the power of the great nobility, and establish absolute autocratic rule. The Oprichniki, dressed in black and bearing emblems of a dog's head and a broom, symbolizing sniffing out treason and sweeping it away, ran rampant in the Oprichnina territories, arbitrarily arresting, executing, and exiling suspected traitors among the nobility and their families, confiscating their lands. Many ancient boyar families were purged, their traditional power severely weakened. The terror of the Oprichnina affected not only the nobility, but also ordinary people. In 1570, suspecting Novgorod of plotting to defect to Lithuania, Ivan IV personally led the Oprichniki in a weeks-long bloody sack and massacre of the city, killing thousands, possibly tens of thousands, of inhabitants. While the Oprichnina temporarily strengthened the Tsar's personal power, it brought disastrous consequences for the country. It disrupted the socio-economic order, intensified class contradictions, led to land abandonment and population flight. It also weakened the state's military capability, contributing to defeats in the ongoing Livonian War, 1558 to 1583, aimed at gaining access to the Baltic Sea against the Crimean Khanate and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which ultimately ended in Russia's failure. In 1572, facing a Crimean Tatar invasion and domestic chaos, Ivan IV abolished the Oprichnina, but the wounds it inflicted were deep. In his later years, Ivan became even more violent, tragically killing his eldest son and heir, Tsarevich Ivan, in a fit of rage, 1581. Ivan IV died in fear and isolation in 1584. He is known as Ivan the Terrible, Ivan Grozny, where Grozny implies awesome or formidable, rather than just terrible. His life was full of contradictions, a co-founder of the unified Russian state, a great reformer and a military conqueror, yet also a cruel and merciless tyrant who implemented a reign of terror. His rule immensely strengthened Tsarist autocracy, but also sowed the seeds for the time of troubles that followed his death. Russian history was henceforth marked by the imprint of autocracy and terror. Chapter 4: Establishment of the Romanov dynasty and the reforms of Peter the Great. After Ivan the Terrible's death, his intellectually disabled second son, Fifer I, reigned 1584 to 1598, succeeded him. Real power lay with Fifer's brother-in-law, the influential boyar Boris Godunov. Godunov was capable, continued the policy of centralization, and in 1589 successfully negotiated with the Patriarch of Constantinople to establish the Patriarchate of Moscow and all Rus, granting the Russian Orthodox Church nominal equality with the ancient patriarchates and enhancing Russia's religious and international prestige. However, Fifer I died childless in 1598, ending the Rurik dynasty. The Zemsky Sobor elected Boris Godunov as the new Tsar, reigned 1598 to 1605. The Godunov dynasty lacked traditional legitimacy and a solid foundation. Compounded by a severe famine in the early 17th century, 1601 to 1603, social tensions intensified, creating fertile ground for its downfall. At this time, an impostor claiming to be Dmitry, Ivan IV's youngest son, who had actually died mysteriously in 1591, appeared with support from Poland and Lithuania. This false Dmitry I successfully entered Moscow and ascended the throne after Godunov's sudden death in 1605. But his reign was short-lived and unstable. His pro-Polish policies and violation of Russian traditions provoked discontent, leading to his overthrow and murder in an uprising led by Moscow boyars, including Vasily Shuaysky. The following year, Shuaysky was proclaimed Tsar Vasily IV, reigned 1606 to 1610, but the country found no peace. Uprisings continued, like the peasant revolt led by Bolotnikov, and a new impostor, false Dmitry II, emerged with Polish backing, even setting up a rival camp outside Moscow. To combat false Dmitry II and Polish interference, Shuaysky sought help from Sweden, which in turn led to Swedish intervention. Poland used this as a pretext to formally invade Russia, capturing Smolensk in 1610 and marching on Moscow. Amidst internal chaos and foreign invasion, Moscow boyars deposed Vasily IV. Polish forces entered Moscow and briefly installed the Polish Prince Władysław as Tsar. The country teetered on the brink of partition and annihilation. This period, circa 1598 to 1613, is known in Russian history as the Time of Troubles, Smutnoye Vremya. At this moment of national peril, patriotic forces within Russian society began to awaken. Kuzma Minin, a merchant from Nizhny Novgorod, and Prince Dmitry Pozharsky issued a call to arms, organizing a popular militia to resist the Polish invaders. In the autumn of 1612, the second militia led by Minin and Pozharsky successfully defeated the Polish interventionist forces and liberated Moscow. In early 1613, a Zemsky Sobor convened in Moscow. After deliberation, they elected Mikhail Romanov, a 16-year-old relative of Ivan IV's first wife, grandnephew of Anastasia Romanovna, as the new Tsar. The rule of the Romanov dynasty, 1613 to 1917, thus began, marking the end of the time of troubles and the restoration of state order in Russia. The early Romanov period, Mikhail, 1613 to 1645, Alexei, 1645 to 1676, Fifer III, 1676 to 1682, focused on recovering from the devastation of war, consolidating central power, and stabilizing social order. They concluded peace treaties with Poland and Sweden, albeit losing some territory, and gradually restored the domestic economy. In 1649, Alexei Mihailovich promulgated the Sobornoye Lazany, Council Code, a systematic legal code covering all aspects of state life. Its most significant provision formally established serfdom, binding peasants to the land for generations and prohibiting free movement, profoundly shaping Russian social structure for centuries. The code also strengthened the Tsars' autocratic power. This era also witnessed a major religious schism. Patriarch Nikon initiated reforms to standardize Russian Orthodox liturgical practices and texts according to contemporary Greek Orthodox norms. These reforms met fierce resistance from the Old Believers, Staroobryatsi, who clung to the older traditions. The church schism led to prolonged social conflict and persecution of the Old Believers. In the latter half of the 17th century, Russia began a slow process of expansion. In Siberia, explorers and Cossacks pushed steadily eastward, reaching the Pacific coast and incorporating the vast Siberian territories into the Russian domain. In the southwest, Russia capitalized on the Ukrainian Cossack uprising against Polish rule, the Khmelnytsky Uprising, and, through the Treaty of Pereyaslav, 1654, incorporated left bank Ukraine, east of the Dnieper, into Russia, triggering a long Russo-Polish war. After Fifer III's death, his two young half-brothers Ivan V, physically infirm, and Peter I, the future Peter the Great, were proclaimed co-Tsars, with their elder half-sister Sophia acting as regent. In 1689, the 17-year-old Peter staged a coup, overthrew Sophia, and began his effective rule. Ivan V remained nominal co-Tsar until his death in 1696. Peter I reigned 1682 to 1725, personal rule from 1689. Known as Peter the Great, was one of the most transformative and influential monarchs in Russian history. Tall, energetic, intensely curious, and possessing a determined, even ruthless personality, he keenly recognized Russia's vast technological, military, economic, and cultural lag behind Western European nations. He resolved to modernize Russia through comprehensive reforms and elevate it to the ranks of European great powers. In 1697 to 1698, Peter traveled incognito with the Grand Embassy to Western Europe, Holland, England, Austria, etc., personally studying shipbuilding, industry, military organization, political systems, and lifestyles. This journey vastly broadened his horizons and solidified his determination to implement westernizing reforms. Upon returning, he immediately launched a series of sweeping changes across political, military, economic, social, and cultural spheres. Military reforms created a powerful regular army and navy, introduced conscription, trained troops according to European models, and adopted modern weaponry and tactics. To gain access to the Baltic Sea, he waged the Great Northern War, 1700 to 1721, against Sweden, then a major Northern European power. Despite an initial disastrous defeat at Narva, Peter persevered, rebuilt his forces, and achieved a decisive victory over Swedish King Charles XII at the Battle of Poltava in 1709. The war concluded with the Treaty of Nystad, granting Russia vast territories along the Baltic coast, including Estonia, Livonia, Ingria, finally securing the coveted outlet to the sea. Administrative reforms abolished the unwieldy Old Boyar Duma, establishing the governing Senate as the highest state body under the Tsar, reorganized central administrative bodies into specialized colleges, collegii, replacing the old prikazy departments to improve efficiency, divided the country into several large provinces, gubernias, to strengthen central control over localities. Economic reforms strongly encouraged industrial and commercial development, especially in military-related sectors, metallurgy, textiles, shipbuilding. Established state-owned factories, offered incentives to private entrepreneurs, and imported Western technology and artisans. Implemented protectionist tariffs. To fund reforms and wars, introduced new taxes like the poll tax, increasing the burden on the populace. Social and cultural reforms mandated Western-style clothing and social customs, ordering nobles to shave their beards and wear European dress. Reformed the Russian alphabet, simplifying Cyrillic script. Established schools, e.g., School of Mathematics and Navigation, artillery schools, engineering schools, Academy of Sciences, and sent young nobles abroad to study. Founded Russia's first newspaper, Vedomosti, the Gazette. Adopted the Julian calendar, starting the year on January 1st. Promoted science and opposed superstition. New capital city. In 1703, on marshy land recently captured from Sweden at the mouth of the Neva River, Peter ordered the construction of a completely new, westernized city, St. Petersburg. In 1712, he moved the capital from ancient Moscow to St. Petersburg, symbolizing Russia's turn towards the west and the sea. The city's construction cost immense human and material resources, with tens of thousands of laborers perishing under harsh conditions. Church reform abolished the Patriarchate and established the Most Holy Synod, a government department overseen by a lay official appointed by the Tsar, effectively subordinating the church to state control. Peter the Great's reforms were imposed top-down, forcefully, and bore the strong imprint of his personal will. They tremendously propelled Russia's modernization, enhancing its national power and international standing. In 1721, the Senate bestowed upon Peter the titles Emperor of all Russia, Imperator Всероссийский, Father of the Fatherland, and the Great. Russia officially became the Russian Empire. However, the reforms came at a heavy price. They intensified serfdom, increased the burden on the common people, and exacerbated social conflicts, leading to uprisings like the Astrakhan and Bulovin revolts. The coercive nature of the reforms and their assault on traditional culture also provoked resistance from parts of society. Peter's reforms laid the foundation for the modern Russian Empire, but also shaped its autocratic, militarized character, marked by an enduring tension between Western and Eastern cultural influences. He opened a window to Europe for Russia, but also left behind deep social fissures. Chapter 5: Imperial Expansion and Social Change, 18th to 19th centuries. After Peter the Great's death, the Russian Empire entered a period of political instability marked by frequent palace coups and rapid changes on the throne. Catherine I, Peter II, Anna Ioannovna, Ivan VI, Elizabeth Petrovna. This era is sometimes called the era of empresses or the era of palace coups. Despite the political turmoil, the foundations laid by Peter's reforms endured, and Russia's power and influence continued to grow. During the reign of Empress Elizabeth, Peter the Great's daughter, 1741 to 1762, Russia performed well in the 7 Years' War, even briefly occupying Berlin. She commissioned the magnificent Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, modeled after Versailles, and founded Moscow University, 1755, fostering cultural and artistic development. Elizabeth's nephew, Peter III, reigned for only 6 months before being overthrown in a palace coup led by his wife, Sophia Augusta Frederica of Anhalt-Zerbst, a German princess who became Catherine II, reigned 1762 to 1796. Known as Catherine the Great, she was another profoundly influential ruler after Peter the Great. Portraying herself as an enlightened despot, she corresponded with Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Diderot, cultivating an image of enlightenment. She convened a legislative commission to draft a new code of laws. Although it failed to produce a new code, it served to gather information about the empire and disseminate Enlightenment ideas. During Catherine's reign, the Russian Empire expanded dramatically. Wars against the Ottoman Empire, Through two Russo-Turkish wars, 1768 to 1774, 1787 to 1792, Russia conquered vast territories along the northern coast of the Black Sea, known as New Russia, including the Crimean Peninsula. This secured access to the Black Sea and established Russia as the dominant power in the region. Partitions of Poland. Catherine collaborated with Prussia and Austria to partition Poland 3 times, 1772, 1793, 1795, erasing this once powerful neighboring state from the map. Russia acquired large territories, including Belarus, right bank Ukraine, and Lithuania. These expansions further solidified Russia's status as a major European and world power. Domestically, Catherine strengthened central authority and noble dominance. Following the suppression of the Pugachev Rebellion, 1773 to 1775, a massive peasant and Cossack uprising that seriously threatened imperial rule, she implemented local administrative reforms in 1775, dividing the country into more provinces and districts to tighten administrative and judicial control. In 1785, she issued the charter to the nobility, confirming and expanding noble privileges, such as exemption from compulsory service and poll taxes, and ownership rights over land and serfs, making the nobility a firm pillar of the empire. Simultaneously, serfdom reached its apex under Catherine, and the condition of serfs worsened. Although Catherine presented herself as enlightened, the outbreak of the French Revolution shifted her attitude towards conservatism and repression. She intensified censorship and cracked down on liberal thought within Russia, e.g., arresting the writer Radishchev. Catherine's son, Paul I, reigned 1796 to 1801, had a brief and erratic reign. His attempts to limit noble privileges and impose Prussian-style military discipline alienated the nobility and military officers, leading to his assassination in a palace coup. His son, Alexander I, reigned 1801 to 1825, initially displayed liberal tendencies. He established an unofficial committee, Privy Committee, to discuss reforms and implemented moderate administrative and educational changes, replacing Petrine colleges with ministries, expanding the university network. However, the defining event of his reign was the Napoleonic Wars. Initially, Russia joined coalitions against France. But after defeats at Austerlitz, 1805, and Friedland, 1807, Alexander I was forced to sign the Treaty of Tilsit with Napoleon, briefly allying with France. However, Russo-French conflicts persisted. In 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia with his Grande Armée of nearly 600,000 men. Under Marshal Kutuzov's command, the Russian army employed a strategy of strategic retreat and scorched earth, engaging the French in the brutal Battle of Borodino near Moscow. Although the Russians retreated and the French occupied an empty Moscow, the subsequent Great Fire and the harsh Russian winter doomed the French army. Napoleon was forced into a disastrous retreat, and his once invincible army was nearly annihilated by the pursuing Russian forces and partisan attacks. The Patriotic War of 1812 was a glorious chapter in Russian history, immensely boosting national pride and patriotism. Russian troops subsequently participated in the liberation of Europe, entering Paris in 1814. Alexander I became a leading figure at the Congress of Vienna, 1814 to 1815, advocating the creation of the Holy Alliance to maintain monarchical order in Europe. The Russian Empire's international prestige reached its zenith, earning it the moniker Gendarme of Europe. However, the war also exposed the backwardness of Russia's serfdom and autocratic system. Many young noble officers who had campaigned in Europe were exposed to Western liberal ideas and became deeply dissatisfied with the domestic situation. They began forming secret societies to plot reform or even revolution. In December 1825, following Alexander I's sudden death, or alleged secret abdication, these noble revolutionaries attempted an uprising in St. Petersburg Senate Square during the accession of his brother, Nicholas I. This Decembrist revolt, though quickly suppressed, marked the beginning of the modern Russian revolutionary movement and had a profound impact on future generations. Nicholas I's reign, 1825 to 1855, was characterized by staunch autocracy and conservatism. He strengthened police control and ideological suppression, establishing the notorious Third Section of His Majesty's own Chancery, the secret police, to ruthlessly crush any liberal thought or opposition. He styled himself as the defender of European order, suppressing the Polish uprising of 1830 to 1831 and assisting Austria in crushing the Hungarian Revolution of 1848. Domestically, he promoted the doctrine of official nationality, orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality to consolidate the empire's ideology. Despite the political conservatism of Nicholas I's era, it witnessed a cultural golden age, producing literary giants like Pushkin, Lermontov, and Gogol, alongside vibrant intellectual debates between Slavophiles and Zapotnik. However, the rigidity and conservatism of Nicholas I's rule ultimately led to disastrous consequences. In the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, Russia fought against an alliance of the Ottoman Empire, Britain, France, and Sardinia, primarily over influence in the Balkans and the Near East. The war exposed Russia's comprehensive backwardness in military technology, transportation, economic strength, and administrative efficiency. Russian forces suffered humiliating defeats, notably at Sevastopol. The failure in the war severely shook the foundations of Tsarist autocracy and made the necessity of reform apparent to all levels of Russian society. Nicholas I died before the war's end, leaving a crisis-ridden empire to his son, Alexander II. Alexander II, reigned 1855 to 1881, is known as the Tsar Liberator. Facing the dire situation after the Crimean War defeat and immense societal pressure for change, he initiated a series of top-down reforms known as the Great Reforms to save the empire. Emancipation of the serfs, 1861, the most crucial reform. Alexander II signed the Emancipation Manifesto, granting serfs personal freedom in law and the right to redeem small land allotments. However, the redemption payments were high, the land often poor and insufficient, and peasants remained tied to village communes, mere, and burdened by economic hardship. While historically significant, the reform's incompleteness sowed seeds for future social conflict. Local self-government reform, 1864 established elected local councils, zemstvos, responsible for local education, health, roads, etc. This represented a limited experiment in local autonomy. Judicial reform, 1864 introduced Western principles like public trials, trial by jury, and legal counsel, enhancing judicial independence and fairness. Military reform, 1874 reduced the length of service, introduced universal military conscription, and improved army equipment and training. Educational reform, eased restrictions on universities, and encouraged the development of primary and secondary education. The Great Reform stimulated Russia's capitalist development and modernization to some extent, but did not touch the core of Tsarist autocracy. The reform's incompleteness, especially the unresolved issues from the serf emancipation, failed to meet the expectations of various social groups. Peasants were dissatisfied with land arrangements, while intellectuals demanded more radical political changes. This led to the rise of the populist movement, Narodniks, who advocated going to the people to incite peasant revolution. After the movement's failure, some radical elements turned to terrorism, forming the People's Will, Narodnaya Volya Party, which targeted high government officials for assassination. In March 1881, just as Alexander II was about to approve a plan that might have introduced limited representative government, he was assassinated by a bomb thrown by members of the People's Will. The tragic end of the reformer pushed Russia back towards conservatism and repression. His son, Alexander III, reigned 1881 to 1894, witnessed his father's assassination and deeply distrusted reform, implementing a policy of counter-reforms and reaction. He strengthened police powers, curtailed local autonomy and judicial independence, tightened controls over education and the press, and pursued Russification policies targeting ethnic minorities. However, economically, Alexander III's reign saw accelerated industrialization, particularly under Finance Minister Sergei Witt, with the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway, attraction of foreign capital, and development of heavy industry. By the end of the 19th century, social contradictions in Russia were becoming increasingly acute. Industrialization brought the growth of the working class and the rise of labor movements, while Marxist ideas began to spread. The peasant land question remained severe. Revolutionary sentiments among intellectuals continued to simmer. Meanwhile, Russia's expansion in the Far East clashed with Japanese interests, setting the stage for turmoil in the early 20th century. Although the Russian Empire was vast and seemingly mighty in military terms, deep social crises were brewing internally, foreshadowing a greater storm. Chapter 6: Revolutions, Wars, and the Establishment of the Soviet Union. At the turn of the 20th century, under the rule of the last Tsar, Nicholas II, reigned 1894 to 1917, social contradictions within the Russian Empire reached an explosive point. Nicholas II inherited his father Alexander III's autocratic ideology, but lacked his firmness and political acumen. Influenced by conservatives and his wife, Empress Alexandra, and her confidant, the mad monk Rasputin, he ignored the growing calls for reform. Rapid industrialization brought not only economic growth but also harsh working conditions, low wages, and a lack of political rights for workers, leading to increasingly militant labor movements. In 1898, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, RSDLP, was founded, propagating Marxism. In 1903, the party split into the Bolsheviks, majority faction, advocating a vanguard party of professional revolutionaries, led by Vladimir Lenin, and the Mensheviks, minority faction, favoring a broader mass party. Simultaneously, the Socialist Revolutionary Party, SRs, representing peasant interests, emerged, inheriting some populist ideas, advocating land socialization, and employing terrorist tactics. Liberals formed the Constitutional Democratic Party, Cadets, seeking peaceful reforms towards a constitutional monarchy. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 served as the catalyst that ignited the social crisis. Competing for influence in Manchuria and Korea, Russia went to war with the rising empire of Japan. The Tsarist government expected an easy victory to distract from domestic problems, but the result was a series of humiliating defeats for the Russian army and navy: fall of Port Arthur, defeat at Mukden, annihilation of the fleet at Tsushima. The military failure thoroughly exposed the incompetence and corruption of the Tsarist regime, further fueling domestic discontent. On January 22, 1905, January 9th US, the Bloody Sunday massacre occurred in St. Petersburg. Tens of thousands of workers and citizens, led by Father Gapon, peacefully marched to the Winter Palace to present a petition to the Tsar, demanding better living conditions and political freedoms. However, troops fired on the unarmed crowd, causing numerous casualties. This event shattered the people's faith in the Tsar and triggered the nationwide revolution of 1905. During the revolution, workers launched massive strikes and formed Soviets, councils, as strike committees. Peasants seized landlord estates and burned manors. Soldiers and sailors mutinied, like the battleship Potemkin uprising, and ethnic minorities demanded autonomy. Facing immense revolutionary pressure, Nicholas II was forced to concede. In October 1905, he issued the October Manifesto, promising civil liberties, freedom of speech, assembly, association, and agreeing to establish a legislative representative body, the State Duma. The October Manifesto somewhat divided the revolutionary camp. Liberals were satisfied, but radical workers and revolutionary parties deemed the concessions insufficient. The Tsarist government used this opportunity to brutally suppress armed workers' uprisings in Moscow and elsewhere. Although ultimately suppressed, the 1905 revolution was Russia's first major bourgeois democratic revolution. It shook the foundations of Tsarist autocracy, tempered revolutionary forces, and provided valuable experience for future revolutions. After the revolution, the Tsarist government did not fully honor the promises of the October Manifesto. Although the State Duma convened, The Tsar curtailed its powers through manipulated electoral laws and frequent dissolutions. Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin simultaneously pursued brutal repression of revolutionaries, military tribunals, Stolypin's necktie for the gallows, and implemented agrarian reforms aimed at dismantling the village commune and creating a class of prosperous peasant landowners, kulaks, as a social base for the regime. Stolypin's reforms achieved some agricultural progress, but failed to solve the fundamental land problem and instead exacerbated rural social stratification. Stolypin was assassinated in 1911, and his reforms stalled. In 1914, World War I broke out. Russia, as a member of the Entente powers, joined the war against the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, etc. Initially, patriotic fervor surged, temporarily masking domestic issues. But as the war dragged on, the Russian army suffered repeated defeats and massive casualties, plagued by shortages of weapons and ammunition. The war devastated the Russian economy. Factories closed, transportation collapsed, food became scarce, prices soared, and the populace endured extreme hardship. Tsar Nicholas II's decision to assume personal command of the army proved disastrous. Lacking military talent, he created a power vacuum at the top, leaving governance in the hands of the Empress and Rasputin, leading to further chaos and corruption. Discontent with the Tsarist government reached its peak across all social strata. In February 1917, by the Julian calendar used in Russia then, Petrograd, St. Petersburg's name since World War I began, erupted in mass strikes and demonstrations. Soldiers refused orders to fire on protesters and instead joined the revolution. Within days, the capital fell into chaos. A provisional committee of the Duma and the Petrograd Soviet of Workers and Soldiers deputies were formed. On March 15th, March 2nd OS, Nicholas II was forced to abdicate, ending the 300-year Romanov dynasty. This was the February Revolution. After the February Revolution, a situation of dual power emerged. The provisional government, formed by the Duma Committee, representing bourgeois and landlord interests, and the Soviets, elected by workers and soldiers. The provisional government insisted on continuing the war and postponed addressing fundamental issues like land reform, failing to meet the people's urgent demands for peace, land, and bread. At this juncture, Bolshevik leader Lenin, long in exile, returned to Petrograd in April. He issued his April theses calling for all power to the Soviets and advocating a socialist revolution. The Bolsheviks' radical platform gained increasing support among workers, soldiers, and poor peasants. In July, the provisional government suppressed demonstrations by Petrograd workers and soldiers, the July Days, forcing the Bolshevik party underground. In August, the army's commander-in-chief, General Kornilov, attempted a coup to establish a military dictatorship. The helpless provisional government had to rely on the Bolshevik-led Red Guards to resist the coup. The failure of the Kornilov coup significantly boosted the Bolsheviks' prestige, shifting the balance of power within the Soviets in their favor. On November 7, 1917, October 25th OS, led by Lenin and Leon Trotsky, the Bolsheviks launched an armed uprising. Red Guards and revolutionary soldiers stormed the Winter Palace, the seat of the provisional government, and overthrew it. That night, the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets convened, declared that all power had passed to the Soviets, and adopted the Decree on Peace, proposing an immediate armistice and peace without annexations or indemnities, and the Decree on Land, abolishing landlord property and distributing land to the peasants. This was the October Revolution. The October Revolution established the world's first socialist state, Soviet Russia, which later, in 1922, joined with other Soviet republics to form a union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR. The nascent Soviet regime faced severe challenges. Internally, overthrown landlords, bourgeoisie, former officers, and other anti-Bolshevik political factions, including some SRs and Mensheviks, formed white armies and launched armed rebellions. Externally, the Allied powers, Britain, France, USA, Japan, etc., unwilling to see Russia exit the war or a socialist state established, intervened militarily against Soviet Russia. From 1918 to 1922, Soviet Russia endured a brutal civil war and foreign intervention. To cope with the war, the Soviet government implemented the policy of war communism, which included grain requisitioning, forcibly seizing surplus grain from peasants, nationalization of industry, abolition of commodity money relations, and universal labor duty. While these extreme measures secured supplies for the Red Army, they severely damaged the interests of peasants and workers, leading to economic collapse and widespread social unrest, like the Kronstadt Rebellion. Led by Lenin and Trotsky, the Red Army ultimately defeated the White Armies and foreign interventionists, defending the Soviet regime. After the Civil War, facing severe economic crisis and political instability, Lenin decided in 1921 to implement the new economic policy, ENU. This policy allowed peasants to dispose of their surplus produce after paying a tax, restored commodity money relations, permitted private ownership of small businesses, and attracted foreign capital. The NEP revived the economy to some extent, consolidated the worker-peasant alliance, and stabilized social order. On December 30th, 1922, Soviet Russia, Ukraine, Belorussia, and the Transcaucasian Federation joined to form the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. In 1924, Lenin died. He left behind a theoretical legacy on building socialism, but also unleashed fierce power struggles within the party. Ultimately, Joseph Stalin, born Ioseb Jugashvili, defeated rivals like Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Bukharin, gradually establishing his absolute leadership over the party and state. Starting in the late 1920s, Stalin abandoned the NEP and launched forced collectivization of agriculture and rapid industrialization. Collectivization aimed to merge individual peasant farms into collective farms, kolkhozes, to secure grain and capital for industrialization and eliminate the kulak class. This process was extremely brutal, involving forced dispossession, mass deportations, and resulted in devastating famines, especially in Ukraine and Kazakhstan, and long-term damage to agricultural productivity. Simultaneously, sacrificing agriculture and light industry, the USSR prioritized heavy industry development. Through a series of 5-year plans, it achieved industrialization in a remarkably short time, building a powerful defense industrial base. The USSR transformed from a backward agrarian country into a major industrial power. However, the Stalinist model was accompanied by a highly centralized political system, suppression of individual freedoms, and large-scale political terror. Starting in the mid-1930s, Stalin unleashed the Great Purge, or Great Terror, to eliminate perceived enemies of the people. Millions of party, state, and military officials, intellectuals, ordinary citizens, and even foreign communists were arrested, sentenced, exiled, or executed. The Red Army leadership was decimated, severely weakening its combat capability. A cult of personality surrounded Stalin, and an atmosphere of fear and repression pervaded society. In foreign policy, the USSR sought collective security agreements with Western powers in the early 1930s to counter fascist Germany, but failed. In August 1939, driven by the failure of Anglo-French appeasement and its own security concerns, the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty, with Nazi Germany, which included secret protocols dividing spheres of influence in Eastern Europe. Subsequently, Germany invaded Poland, starting World War II. The USSR occupied eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and fought the Winter War against Finland. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany violated the pact and launched a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. The Great Patriotic War, as the Soviets called the Eastern Front of World War II, began. Initially, due to lack of preparedness, the purge's damage to the military, and Stalin's strategic misjudgments, the Soviet army suffered enormous losses and vast territories were occupied. However, under extremely difficult conditions, the Soviet people demonstrated unprecedented patriotism and resilience. Through bloody battles like the defense of Moscow, the Battle of Stalingrad, and the Battle of Kursk, the Red Army gradually turned the tide, launching a strategic offensive in 1943. In May 1945, Soviet forces captured Berlin, and Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Soviet Union made immense national sacrifices. Official figures exceed 27 million deaths, and a decisive contribution to the victory over fascism. World War II radically changed the global balance of power. As a victorious nation, the Soviet Union's international prestige soared, becoming a superpower rivaling the United States. Pro-Soviet socialist regimes were established in most Eastern European countries, forming the Soviet-led Eastern Bloc. However, ideological, geopolitical, and national interest conflicts soon led to confrontation between the former allies, the US and USSR, ushering in the decades-long Cold War. Chapter 7: The Soviet Union during the Cold War and the Empire's Collapse. After World War II, although the Soviet Union achieved a glorious victory, it came at an immense cost. Large parts of the country's western regions lay in ruins, the economy was severely damaged, and the population loss was staggering. Stalin maintained the highly centralized wartime system and his personality cult, and the domestic political atmosphere remained tense. Large-scale repression continued, albeit on a reduced scale. Ideological control tightened, strictly guarding against Western cultural influences. Internationally, the Cold War landscape solidified with the formation of the US-led Western Bloc and the Soviet-led Eastern Bloc. Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in 1946 marked the public start of the Cold War. The US implemented the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan to contain Soviet influence. The USSR responded by supporting communist parties worldwide, establishing the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, Comecon, in 1949, and forming the Warsaw Pact military alliance in 1955 to counter the US-led North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. The arms race was a central feature of the Cold War. In 1949, the USSR successfully tested its atomic bomb, breaking the US nuclear monopoly. Subsequently, both superpowers raced to develop more powerful hydrogen bombs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, and various advanced weapons, creating a balance of terror. The space race also unfolded, with the Soviets initially taking the lead, launching the first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, in 1957, and sending Yuri Gagarin into space in 1961, making him the first human in orbit. In March 1953, Stalin died. His death ended an era and created an opportunity for change. After a brief period of collective leadership and power struggles, Nikita Khrushchev, first secretary of the Communist Party Central Committee, 1953 to 1964, gradually consolidated his leadership. Upon taking power, Khrushchev initiated a series of reforms known as the Thaw. In 1956, at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party, he delivered a secret speech denouncing Stalin's personality cult and exposing the crimes of his era, particularly the Great Purge. This caused enormous shock both domestically and internationally. Khrushchev rehabilitated large numbers of officials and citizens persecuted under Stalin, released millions of political prisoners, relaxed controls in the cultural sphere, and allowed the publication of some previously banned literary works, like Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. Economically, Khrushchev attempted to reform the rigid planned economy, expanding enterprise autonomy, increasing investment in agriculture and light industry, and improving living standards. He launched the large-scale Virgin Lands campaign, plowing up virgin soil in Kazakhstan and elsewhere, and enthusiastically promoted corn cultivation. He also reformed administrative structures, trying to break the monopolies of central ministries. In foreign policy, Khrushchev advocated peaceful coexistence, peaceful competition, and peaceful transition to socialism, seeking détente with the West. However, he also undertook risky actions. In 1956, Soviet troops suppressed the Hungarian uprising. In 1961, the Berlin Wall was built. In 1962, the deployment of Soviet missiles in Cuba led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, bringing the world to the brink of nuclear war, which ended with the Soviet withdrawal of the missiles. During Khrushchev's era, Sino-Soviet relations deteriorated sharply due to ideological differences and conflicting national interests, eventually leading to a complete split between the two parties and countries. While Khrushchev's reforms broke the stalemate of the Stalinist model and brought some dynamism, they were plagued by problems. Reforms lacked systematic planning, were often implemented erratically, harebrained schemes, and reflected strong subjectivity, like the promise of achieving communism with goulash. The Virgin Lands campaign damaged the environment, and agricultural problems persisted. While necessary, the critique of Stalin undermined the party's authority and social beliefs. His foreign policy, alternating between détente and confrontation, also caused dissatisfaction domestically and internationally. In October 1964, Khrushchev was ousted in an internal party coup. Khrushchev was succeeded by Leonid Brezhnev, General Secretary of the Central Committee, 1964 to 1982. The Brezhnev era is often referred to as the era of stagnation. Politically, Brezhnev ended Khrushchev's thaw, reasserting ideological control and suppressing dissent, e.g., exiling Solzhenitsyn, placing Sakharov under house arrest. The party-state bureaucracy became increasingly rigid, bloated, and corrupt, forming a privileged elite, the nomenklatura. The leadership aged, lacking dynamism. Economically, Brezhnev reversed some of Khrushchev's reforms, returning to a more centralized planned economy. Initially, fueled by revenues from oil and gas exports, the Soviet economy still grew, living standards improved somewhat, and military power reached rough parity with the United States. However, deep-seated structural problems, distorted priorities, heavy industry and military first, light industry and agriculture lagging, slow technological progress, inefficiency became increasingly severe. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Soviet economic growth nearly halted, and the gap with Western developed countries widened again. In foreign policy, Brezhnev pursued an assertive expansionist policy. He formulated the Brezhnev Doctrine, or Doctrine of Limited Sovereignty, to justify intervention in other socialist countries. In 1968, Soviet forces invaded Czechoslovakia to crush the Prague Spring reform movement. In the 1970s, the USSR expanded its global influence, supporting pro-Soviet regimes and national liberation movements in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. In 1979, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan began a decade-long quagmire that drained vast resources and damaged its international reputation. Although the Brezhnev era saw the USSR reach its military zenith, appearing immensely powerful, internal stagnation, corruption, economic decline, and the burden of the Afghan war signaled an impending crisis. After Brezhnev's death in 1982, two elderly and infirm leaders, Yuri Andropov, 1982 to 1984, and Konstantin Chernenko, 1984 to 1985, held power briefly. In March 1985, the relatively young and energetic Mikhail Gorbachev, then 54, was elected General Secretary. Gorbachev deeply understood the severe crisis facing the Soviet Union and was determined to reform. He initially proposed a strategy of acceleration, uskorenai, hoping to revitalize the economy through technological progress and structural adjustment, but achieved little success. He then shifted to more comprehensive reforms under the slogans of perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness. Perestroika aimed at fundamentally transforming the Soviet economic and political system. Economically, it involved attempts to introduce market mechanisms, increase enterprise autonomy, and allow private cooperatives and individual enterprise. Politically, Gorbachev sought to break the Communist Party's monopoly on power, promoting political pluralism, establishing new power bodies, the Congress of People's Deputies, and a reformed Supreme Soviet, and introducing competitive elections. Glasnost meant relaxing censorship of speech and the press, encouraging discussion and criticism of historical issues, especially the Stalinist period, and social problems. This greatly invigorated public discourse, but also opened Pandora's box. Long-suppressed nationalist sentiments, discontent with communist rule, and revelations about historical truths surged forth, quickly exceeding Gorbachev's original intentions and control. Gorbachev's reforms, intended to restore the true face of socialism, descended into chaos and loss of control. Economic reforms were poorly coordinated, leading to further economic deterioration, worsening shortages, and rampant inflation. Political reforms weakened the Communist Party's leading role and central government authority without establishing effective new power structures. Glasnost led to ideological confusion and the erosion of social cohesion. Meanwhile, nationalism and separatism surged in the constituent republics. The Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, were the first to declare the restoration of their independence. Ethnic conflicts intensified in Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and elsewhere. Even within the Russian Federation, the core republic, its popularly elected president, Boris Yeltsin, began demanding greater sovereignty. A fierce power struggle erupted between Yeltsin and Gorbachev. On August 19, 1991, hardline officials within the Communist Party launched a coup attempt, the August coup, seeking to prevent Gorbachev from signing a new union treaty that would transform the USSR into a loose confederation. Gorbachev was placed under house arrest. However, the coup met determined resistance from Yeltsin and Moscow citizens, and the military remained neutral. After 3 days, the coup collapsed. The August coup was the final blow that shattered the Soviet Union. It utterly destroyed the authority of the Communist Party and the central government. In its aftermath, republic after republic declared independence. Although Gorbachev was restored to power, he was largely irrelevant. On December 8th, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met in Belovezha Forest, Belarus, and signed an agreement declaring that the USSR ceased to exist and establishing the Commonwealth of Independent States, CS. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev delivered a televised address announcing his resignation as president of the USSR. That evening, the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time, replaced by the tricolor flag of the Russian Federation. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which had existed for nearly 70 years, formally dissolved. A superpower that had once shaken the world vanished abruptly from the historical stage without a major war, leaving behind an enduring legacy and complex implications for the world. Chapter 8: The Nascent Russian Federation and 21st Century Challenges. Following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation, Rossiyskaya Federatsiya, as its largest successor state, embarked on a difficult period of transition. Boris Yeltsin, president of Russia, 1991 to 1999, became the new nation's first leader, facing the daunting task of transitioning from a planned economy to a market economy and from a one-party state to a democratic political system. In the economic sphere, the Yeltsin government implemented radical shock therapy, primarily under Prime Minister Yegor Gaidar. This policy aimed to rapidly establish a market economy through swift price liberalization, cuts in government spending, and large-scale privatization. However, shock therapy resulted in hyperinflation, a dramatic decline in production, a sharp drop in living standards, and a rapidly widening gap between rich and poor. During the chaotic mass privatization, a small group of politically connected oligarchs seized control of vast state assets, gaining dominance over key sectors of the economy and fueling profound social injustice. Politically, Russia experienced a transition from the Soviet system to a presidential republic. In 1993, a severe constitutional crisis erupted between Yeltsin and the Supreme Soviet Parliament, led by Vice President Alexander Rutskoy and Speaker Ruslan Kaspalatov, who opposed his reform policies. The conflict escalated, culminating in the October events. Yeltsin ordered the army to shell the parliament building, the White House, and forcibly dissolved the Supreme Soviet. Subsequently, a new constitution was adopted, establishing a highly centralized presidential system granting the president immense powers. While this event consolidated Yeltsin's power, it damaged the image of Russian democracy. In foreign policy during the Yeltsin era, Russia initially adopted a strongly pro-Western stance, hoping to integrate into the Western world and receive aid. However, events like NATO expansion and the Kosovo War led Russia to feel its national interests and security were threatened, gradually causing rifts in its relations with the West. Domestically, ethnic separatism plagued the new federation. Particularly in the North Caucasus region, the Chechen Republic declared independence, leading to two brutal Chechen wars against the federal government. First, 1994 to 1996, second, beginning in 1999. The wars caused massive casualties and destruction and further destabilized Russian society. By the late 1990s, the Russian economy was near collapse. A major financial crisis erupted in 1998, featuring a massive devaluation of the ruble and government debt default. Political instability was rife, social order had broken down, and popular disillusionment with the Yeltsin government was widespread. The country's power and international standing had declined precipitously. On December 31, 1999, Yeltsin made a surprise New Year's Eve announcement of his resignation, appointing the then Prime Minister, Vladimir Putin, as acting president. Putin, a former KGB officer, had subsequently worked in the St. Petersburg city government and Yeltsin's presidential administration. His tough stance during the Second Chechen War had earned him popular support. Putin was formally elected president in March 2000, serving his first and second terms 2000 to 2008, third term 2012 to 2018, fourth term 2018 present, with Dmitry Medvedev serving as president 2008 to 2012 while Putin was prime minister. Upon taking office, Putin said about restoring state order and strengthening central authority. He implemented the power vertical system, increasing federal control over regions and curtailing the power of regional leaders. He took measures to curb the political influence of the oligarchs, bringing some strategic industries like oil and gas back under state control or into the hands of companies closely aligned with the government. Economically, the Putin government benefited significantly from a sharp rise in global oil prices and a relatively stable political environment, allowing the Russian economy to recover and grow. The government repaid substantial foreign debt, increased pensions and public sector wages, and improved living standards for many. However, progress on economic diversification and structural reform remained slow, and heavy reliance on energy exports persisted. On the Chechen issue, Putin adopted a hardline policy, largely suppressing large-scale armed conflict and installing pro-Moscow local leadership, the Kadyrov family. Nevertheless, the security situation in the North Caucasus remained complex. In foreign policy, Putin abandoned Yeltsin's pro-Western tilt, pursuing a more pragmatic, assertive, and multi-vector approach. He focused on restoring Russia's great power status and international influence, opposing American unipolarity. Relations with Western countries evolved through phases of cooperation, competition, and confrontation. While cooperation occurred on issues like counterterrorism and the Iranian nuclear program, sharp disagreements arose over NATO expansion, missile defense systems, the 2008 Georgia War, and the 2014 Ukraine crisis. In 2014, following a change of government in Ukraine, Russia swiftly moved troops to control the Crimean Peninsula and subsequently annexed it after a controversial referendum. Simultaneously, conflict erupted in Ukraine's eastern Donbas region between pro-Russian separatist forces and the Ukrainian government, with Russia accused of backing the separatists. The annexation of Crimea and the crisis in Ukraine led to a sharp deterioration in relations between Russia and Western countries, resulting in severe economic sanctions imposed on Russia and retaliatory measures from Moscow. In recent years, Russia has played a more active role in international affairs, notably intervening militarily in the Syrian civil war to support the government of Bashar al-Assad, significantly boosting its influence in the Middle East. Russia has also strengthened strategic cooperation with non-Western powers like China. Domestically, Putin has enjoyed long-term rule and consistently high approval ratings, attributed to relative economic stability, the restoration of order, and a popular desire for strong leadership. However, concerns and criticisms persist regarding limitations on political freedoms, media independence, and the space for opposition activities. In 2020, constitutional amendments were passed, potentially allowing Putin to run for president again after his current term ends in 2024 and possibly remain in power until 2036. On February 24, 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, termed a special military operation. This action, aimed at preventing Ukraine's NATO membership, achieving Ukraine's demilitarization and denazification, and protecting Russian speakers in the Donbass, triggered the largest military conflict in Europe since World War II. The invasion met with widespread international condemnation and unprecedentedly harsh sanctions, dealing severe blows to Russia's economy, society, and international image, while causing an immense humanitarian crisis. The war's trajectory and ultimate outcome remain highly uncertain and will undoubtedly have profound long-term consequences for Russia and the world. As of today, in 2025, the Russian Federation stands at a new historical crossroads. It carries the legacy of the vast territory, rich resources, unique cultural traditions, and complex great power heritage of both Tsarist Russia and the Soviet Union. Having navigated the chaos following the Soviet collapse, the stability and assertiveness of the Putin era, and the severe challenges posed by the current war in Ukraine, Russia's future is filled with uncertainty. How can it achieve economic modernization and sustainable development while safeguarding national unity and sovereignty? How will it define its place in a complex global order and manage relations with the West, the East, and its neighbors? How will it balance strong governance with civil society and state interests with individual freedoms? These are the pressing questions Russia must confront and answer. The historical river of this transcontinental nation continues its powerful flow, shaping itself and influencing the world. Thank you for listening. The history of Russia is a grand epic filled with dramatic turns, profound contradictions, and an indomitable spirit. From the dawn of Kievan Rus to the shadow of Mongol rule, from the expansion of the Tsarist Empire to the rise and fall of the Soviet Union, and onto the struggles and explorations of the new Russia, this land has witnessed countless moments of glory and suffering, transformation and endurance. If you're intrigued by this turbulent history or wish to explore more captivating stories and insightful analyses, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support is our greatest motivation to continue creating content. We look forward to meeting you again in our next episode as we continue to explore the mysteries of history together.